In the beginning of this story, our main character Glenn was kicked out from his party. They tells him that they kept his so far for his past successes, but now they had found a replacement for him. He was another swordsman. They tells him very bluntly that they do not need him anymore. Glenn could see why they were doing this. They were waiting for getting to B rank, and now that it was done, they were betraying him. They asks him if he had any last wish. Glenn asks them if he can have a chat with his replacement. Their leader tells him that his replacement was called Ralph and can talk to him. Ralph tells Glenn that he has heard that he was the best swordsman in the world. Glenn replies him that before he can tell him about that, there was something more important about the party that he want to tell him. He asks Ralph what bad rumors had he heard about him. Ralph looks away and tells him slowly that he has heard that Glenn indulge heavily in brothels and have slept with a lot of town girls. Glenn tells him that the rest three always do it. Glenn tells him to wear earplugs if he do not want to hear it. He tells Ralph that all four always bangs each others in the tents. Ralph tells him that the leader does it with all three girls. Glenn then tells him that he did visited brothels frequently as he was left out and always heard them doing it. Glenn adds that the party has more problems than that. Then the leader shows up and asks Glenn if he was not done talking. Thus, Glenn saves the rest for some other time and leaves. He was thinking about how they had known each other since childhood and had been doing adventures together ever since then. He also wonders what happened to the money he sent home under the party's name. They together managed to get to the B rank and Glenn himself was a rank. But now there was no point regretting all that. He asks Coachman how long will it take them to arrive their destination. He replies that it might take them a few more days. He finally reaches the church he grew up in. The father took in more orphans than there were. He tells all the children to go inside, and then he tells Glenn that his rumors had spread all over the area. He was ashamed to even introduce him to the children. Glenn was very annoyed that his whole reputation was now ruined. Everyone was looking down on him. He tells them all that it was the last time he will set foot in the church and also the last time he will give them money. Thus, he leaves that place telling them that he does not need them anymore. But from inside, he was despaired. He recalls his past. He was always called a weakling by everyone. All the big kids always bullied him and made him cry. From the childhood, he kept wondering about how can he change his personality. He read a lot of books to find out that. He learnt from there that, by stimulating brain waves with lightning magic, he can modify his personality and memories. He grabbed that book and ran to a backyard to read it properly. He reads the spells to learn the lightning magic and apply it on his head. He lost his senses after that. There was a fairy that always took care of him. She was the chief of the fairies. The other fairies saw him knocked out and informs her. Just like before. Now also when Glenn was knocked out on the street, the fairy comes again and places his head on her lap and griefs that he overdid it again. She could understand his pain of getting betrayed by his own people. Glenn always appreciated her beautiful wings since childhood. She always looked after him. But this time, it was looking like his brain was damaged and his eyes were in terrible shape. She did not want him to die yet. With all her heart she blesses him with a new life. After that, Glenn wakes up hasping. He looks around and wonders where was he. Then the other two little fairies asks him if he was feeling any better now. He looks at them and wonders if he had ever seen fairies before. He had a slightest feel that he had. He was struggling a lot to remember his past. Then the chief fairy greets him good morning. Glenn wonders if he came to a brothel again by being unconscious. The fairy tells him that he did not, that she was Freyna, the chief of fairies. She tells him to feel free to chat with her. Glenn asks her if she knows who he was. Freyna answers him that she has known him for a long time. She changes her appearance a little bit and then asks Glenn if he could recall her now. Glenn asks him if she was the fairy he met at the flower garden, to which Freyna replies that she was indeed the same fairy. She tells him that she fell for his love that day and then she formed a contract with him to look over him all the time. Glenn asks her again to tell him where were they at that moment. Freyna replies him that he was in a fairy realm and he was the first human to ever set foot in it. She apologizes for healing him without his permission. She tells him that she just did not wanted him to die yet. Glenn smiles as he did wanted the same. Freyna tells him further that he might have turned into a cripple if she had not healed him and also she had to fiddle with his eyes a bit. Glenn checks his eyes in a mirror and finds out that its color was changed. It was now fairy eyes, a gift from Freyna. Glenn could not believe that now he had fairy eyes. Freyna tells him that it's kind of magical eyes. Glenn asks her what sort of powers does it have. She replies that with the help of it, he can use Eye Moment, which means he can teleport to any place he wish. The second power was Eye of Appraisal, which can allow him to see composition abilities and illness. She adds further that it also have Eye of Far Seeing, Eye of Perception and also the Eye of Foresight. Glenn was having a hard time keeping up with all that. On top of that, she also tells him that he can also use the Fairy Queen when he needs, who was herself. Glenn just could not believe that he was so much overpowered now. Glenn asks her motives. She replies that she just wanted to do it for his sake and nothing else. She also tells him that he will need extensive training to master the eye. Glenn tells her with a smile that she has done enough for him. Freyna blushes and faints out. The other fairies tells Glenn that his smile can do that to her. They starts complaining that she always keeps him to herself. They asks Glenn to chat with them too. Thus, they chats a little bit together. Then later that day, Freyna starts training Glenn for his fairy eye. It was way more tough than Glenn was expecting. He was completely exhausted after a few hours. Freyna asks him if she went too overboard in a sarcastic manner. Glenn gets angry and shouts at her that he will show her and prove her wrong by mastering the fairy eye. He then goes to the hot spring to take a bath and to relax. Freyna also comes there and tells him that he was acting more and more like an old man with each passing day. Glenn was wondering if she was trying to join him in bath now. She gets in and asks him if he was getting used to his new eyes. He tells her that sometimes the color of his eyes surprises him, but he likes it better than the previous one. Glenn then feels like there were more fairies than before. Freyna tells him that they were getting attracted to his mana. Thus, they were there to see him. Glenn asks her why were they so fond of him. Freyna replies him that the main reason was the quality of his mana. The little fairies were helping him while he was using the magic. She tells him that when they helps him, they in a way signs a pact with him that allows them to receive the mana from him. This meant that he had the greatest number of contracts with the fairies in the entire world. Glenn was surprised to hear all this. Freyna assumes that his contract with her was so strong that he could not notice the other contracts. Glenn replies her that he does not know all that as it was his first ever contract. Freyna hugs him and tells him to cheer up. Glenn becomes super uncomfortable. Glenn starts splashing the water everywhere and later catches a cold due to it. Freyna apologizes him for causing the trouble. Glenn replies that it was his own fault as he created a scene while being naked. Freyna tells him that she will bring him some fruits when she returns and leaves. Glenn realizes that he had been falling ill since a long time, since childhood. His body was super weak as a child and that caused a lot of worry to his sisters. There was Miss Aria who always looked after him when he fell ill as a child. Glenn was now wondering how would she be doing in her life. He could not find her when he went to the church. After sleeping properly for some time, now he was ready for training again. He was looking very fired up. Freyna tells him that she will first start attacking him this time. Glenn was not expecting anything less. They resumes their training and this time Freyna was really impressed from his growth. He had improved a lot in the past few days. Glenn tells her that now he was aware of his powers properly. That might be the reason why he could now use it more properly. Freyna was looking a little worried. So, Glenn asks her what was the matter. Freyna with a very gloomy face asks him when was he going to leave the fairy realm. Glenn was shocked to hear this. He replies her that he has not given it much thought. He tells her that he does want to test his skills in the outside world, but he was now feeling too comfortable in the fairy realm that he did not want to leave. But above all, the real reason for him was Freyna herself. He wanted to live with her. Freyna gets emotional again and hugs him tightly. Later she apologizes Glenn again for asking him such questions. Glenn replies her that it was his fault for not noticing what was on her mind. Then he tells her that they should get back to their magic training. Freyna asks him if he was good at lightning magic. Glenn replies her that he could use it since childhood. But ever since he arrived in the fairy realm, he could now use all the elements equally. Freyna tells him that he can trust her on that she will teach him to use them in combats in no time. Glenn gets excited and asks him what do he need to do for that. Freyna tells him that he just need to ask for their help. Glenn was confused, so he tries doing it. He produces some electricity in his hand and then asks the other small fairies to lend him some power. As the fairies helps him, he shoots a lightning strike at the rock in front. Glenn was shocked to see how powerful it was, but it also drains his energy. Glenn asks Freyna what can he use it for. Freyna contemplates and replies him that there will be people who will be jealous of his contracts and will cause a lot of troubles for him. There was nothing scarier than human envy. So, Freyna tells him that it would be better for him if he does not interact with them in the human world. In other words, back in the human world, they will have to avoid Glenn. Glenn starts feeling as he felt forever to be left alone. He did not wanted that anymore. He tells them that he will never cut ties with them even in the human world. That he will beat back anyone who attacks him out of envy. His adventurer's license was going to expire in just 10 days. He asks them to blast him with all the magic. Glenn tells Freyna that he was aware that there were many people in the human world who will mess with him, so he wanted to train in the fairy land enough to crush anyone who does in a second. Freyna promises him that she will train him thoroughly. She tells him to keep using magic until he hits his limit and to concentrate on hitting the target. Glenn was confident in his accuracy. Slowly with time, his accuracy was now better than anyone. Freyna was very happy to see him getting better so fast. He tells Freyna to throw the targets faster. Freyna gets tired, but Glenn was not. After training a lot, Glenn was not sure what should he do next. He was all out of energy and Freyna was all out of targets. Freyna then tells him that she was preparing for the real training. She snaps and a lot of little fairies appears behind him. She tells him that he will use the power of them now. Glenn was looking forward to it. Freyna tells him that the training was to commune with the little one's power, that he will have to do it with everyone there. She was the one to first do it. She holds his hands and then allows her mana to flow into his body. Glenn tries to receive it, but it was tough for him at start. But then after trying several times, he eventually learns it. After receiving Freyna's mana, Glenn was feeling very powerful. He was feeling as if he can take down a dragon. Freyna tells him that he can get even stronger. He goes to the hot spring again to relax after all that training. And as always, the little fairies and Freyna was also there. Freyna tells him that it took him too long to commune with her, but he could do it so easily with the little fairies. She was feeling a little jealous. Glenn was not sure what to tell, but he thanks her for helping him with the training. He tells her that he was feeling much powerful than before. It was shocking for him that his powers had no drawbacks. Freyna tells him that now even if a country comes after him, he will be able to beat them, and also now his enemies were their enemies, so they will help him if required. Glenn was feeling extremely confident that he will never lose to anyone with this many fairies with him. Freyna mockingly tells him that he should fight a dragon next. Glenn tells her that he can definitely try it. But actually that day, Freyna and Glenn were to spare each other. The battle begins and they both starts with their elemental attacks. Freyna was impressed by him and tells him that he was no longer a mediocre magical knight but now was a beast. They both goes all out and in the end, Glenn wins. Freyna was embarrassed and Glenn was even mocking her on top of that. Then Glenn tells her that as she used to look upon him since childhood, that means she must know that he visited brothels often. Glenn tells her that he has some addictions to girls, but now he was not feeling anything looking at her. She tells him that when he used lightning magic to heal himself, it turned his suffering into greed and stopped him from breaking. Glenn realizes that it was pretty reckless by him. He was glad that now he had the fairies to talk about his problems. Then after getting out of the bath, he asks Freyna if the fairy realm did not have 4 seasons like the human world. Freyna tells him that she can control the weather as she wants, so she was making it more comfortable. She tells him that winter was almost over in the real world. Glenn recalls that he came to the fairyland in the early spring. This meant that he was there for almost a year. His adventurer's license was about to expire soon, so he needed to return soon. Freyna tells him that he needs to decide which fairy would return with him to the human world. Glenn was not sure. Freyna asks him if he wanted to enter the human world with all of them. Glenn was thinking of something like that. He tells her that he thought that everyone made contract with him as they were interested in him. So, he thought that it will be unfair to pick a few and leave the rest. But also having that many fairies around him was kind of troublesome. He tells them that that was why he trained so hard to begin with. Freyna hugs Glenn tightly again. Glenn was wondering if they can do something to not make it noticeable. Freyna tells him that fairies could hide themselves without using power. She shows him a demo and disappears. But there was one flaw to this, that other fairies will still be able to see them. That means, a human that has contracted with a fairy will be able to see them. But Glenn was not worried about all that. He just wanted to live with them all very happily. Freyna tells him that now she need to do some important preparations, and then she shows Glenn the barriers and traps that protects the fairy land. So, the traps will manage the enemies that will try to enter the fairy realm in their absence. Then she asks Glenn if his enemies were his ex-party and the church. Glenn replies that they were and he no longer cares about the people that abandoned him. They then decides to take their last bath in the fairy realm. On the other hand, in the human world, people were trying their best to find Glenn who was missing. Flora was searching Glenn on top of all. She believed that the Renava company was at where it was all thanks to him only. She asks her teammates how did the investigation went. He replies that after getting expelled from his party, he was last seen at the church in his hometown and then there was no sign of him after that. The guys also informs Flora that now cracks were appearing in Glenn's former party. Glenn was doing a lot to hold the party together. The team was blaming the swordsman that replaced Glenn, Ralph. Flora was excited to see falling them apart. She had almost an evil look on her face. Then she tells him to keep investigating and leaves. Then later that day, a lady named Maria Bayron shows up in the head office of Renava Company. She tells Flora that she was the 3rd daughter of County Bayron. She tells her that she was there to talk about Glenn. Flora remembers that Glenn used to mention her as sister and that she taught him to read complex things. Flora asks her if Glenn knew her. She replies that he did very well. Then she asks her with a furious look to tell her everything she knew about Glenn's disappearance. Flora gets scared and tells her everything she knew. Flora asks her if she believes the rumors about him. Maria replies that she does not believe a word of it, as she knew him very well, but she also knew that the capital city had changed him a lot. She tells her that the swordsman who joined them left after a month as the party was so bad. Rumors were against him for a rape attempt, and their leader Elaine was the one to spread those rumors. He was more sociable than Glenn, and the church was also going downhill now. They found out that the person in charge was embezzling Glenn's donations, so he was imprisoned. Glenn was helping the church a lot with his solo missions. Flora asks Maria if she needs something. Maria tells her that they need some children's food and clothes and also some bedding. Flora wanted to make sure that Glenn does not think that she abandoned his family. Maria thanks her for the help. Meanwhile, Glenn and Freyna arrives in the human realm using the Eye of Moment. Glenn was very impressed with the skills of the fairy eyes. There were a lot of people. There was a huge line of people. Freyna asks Glenn why was not he there. Glenn replies that the line was for normal people. He was in a rank adventurer, so he had a separate line for him. He goes to the counter and tells the guy that he wants to renew his license. It was the same guy, Ludger, who was investigating about Glenn with Flora. He was shocked to see Glenn in front of him suddenly. He rushes to Flora's office and informs her. Flora also arrives there and keeps staring at Glenn. They both hugs Glenn tightly. Glenn uses eye movement to get away a little. They were shocked to see it. They asks him what happened to his eyes. Then they all goes inside and Glenn tells them everything. Freyna also shows up and meets them. Flora was not surprised anymore that they could not find him in the world as he was in a different world. They asks him how he teleported earlier. Glenn tells them that he can do cool stuffs using his eyes. Ludger asks him if he should really be telling that to even them. Glenn replies that it might get him into more trouble, but they both were very decent to him in the past, so he was comfortable sharing it with them. Then bursting through the door, Maria also shows up. She had teary eyes and tells Glenn that she always believed that he was alive. Glenn was shocked to see that all three of them knew each other. Then tells Glenn everything that was going on with the party and the church. They shows him a record of Elaine's party activities. The quality of the materials they were giving to the guild had reduced. It was now a D-rank party. Ralph had left too. Glenn asks Flora why did she had it. Flora replies that to check if they had any involvement with the church's crimes. Glenn tells them that he saw a shady person around the labyrinth and Elaine was meeting him alone without the party knowing. Glenn recalls the pendant the guy was wearing. It was of a snake and a sword. Freyna shows him a logo from a book and asks him if it was the same. Glenn replies that it was exactly the same. Ludger tells Glenn that now they will be able to solve the case all thanks to him. Ludger welcomes back Glenn gladly. Glenn asks them if they will join him on his mission. He was determined to earn a lot of money. Freyna tells him that she will for sure. The little fairies also shows their interest. Glenn tells them that they will go to an out-of-the-way labyrinth to collect materials. They will hunt monsters and then they will sell the materials obtained from them. Freyna now understands how he earns money. She asks him what was glowing at some distance. Glenn tells her that it was the labyrinth moss. It was helpful to have around because it lights the area. He also tells them that herbs and ores also goes for a very good price. Then they finally goes to the labyrinth where they first encounters a mob of orcs. Glenn was planning to kill them without too much damage since they are edible. Freyna suggests him to use water magic in that case. Glenn also thinks that it will be a good idea. Thus, using water magic he defeats all the orcs. Then they encounters a pack of one-horned white wolves. Glenn slashes off all of them as well. Glenn was done for that day. On the other hand, there were the heroes' party were struggling to collect materials on the same labyrinth. Elaine was blaming other members for that. They had posted a recruitment notice but no one was coming. They were doubting that Ralph was spreading wrong rumors about them. They were pissed as Ralph left the party after only 1 month and Glenn also disappeared suddenly. Elaine tells Emily to not make such scary faces as it was distorting her beauty. He hugs her and tells her that they cannot change what happened to Elaine. He was successful to deceive even Emily who was in love with Glenn. He remembers how they met when they were a child. Elaine was the one to introduce himself first, but Glenn was more of an introvert. But from the beginning, Emily was always after Glenn. Elaine was very jealous of this. She always used to say that as she loves Glenn, she will marry him when they grow up. When they comes to the age when then can leave the church, they were asked what were they planning to do next. Elaine told them that he was planning to become adventurers with Glenn, Emily and the others. Glenn could not understand back then what were his motives. He was planning to bring them both to the outside world and then to tear the two of them apart from each other. He started spreading wrong rumors. Glenn realized it later that he was being hated everywhere due to those rumors. Some people suggested him to leave the party in that case. His dear ones tried to give him sympathy, but he was simply not in a state to accept any of it. He was tired of hearing all the bad rumors about himself. Elaine was having fun with Emily while he was suffering. And then one day he was fired. But now without Glenn, they were having troubles. No new members were joining them and there were not much paying quests. Elaine was wondering what shall they do now. Then they hears that Glenn has came back. The next day, Glenn was in a restaurant eating some delicious meat. People were staring at him. He was different from what they had heard about him. Freyna tells Glenn that he was the center of attention wherever he goes. Then the leader of Silver Knights, Garius Silva, comes to Glenn and meets him. Glenn asks him when did he come back to the capital. Silva tells him that he was about to ask him the same question. Silva asks him why he disappeared while he was gone. Whether he hates him that much. Glenn tells him that he does not hate him but also does not like him either. Silva was just too intense for him. Glenn was simply eating meat while Silva was getting concerned. This annoys Silva, but Glenn tells him that it should not matter as they both were not that close. Silva though invited Glenn to join them many times. Silva tells him that his contracted fairy was freaking out looking at his fairy and asks if his fairy was really that amazing. Glenn tells him that she was. Silva shows him a clan membership application form and asks Glenn to sign it. Glenn was surprised to see that he still had not given up. Silva tells him that he cannot give up on him as he loves his powers. Glenn asks Freyna what's her opinion on this. Freyna replies him that the little fairies were telling her that the people of the clan gets along well, so it might be a good idea to try it out. Glenn then asks Silva if it was possible for him to join as a trial. Silva tells him that once he joins the clan he will get to know how genuinely good the clan was. Glenn however was not sure that he will stay in the clan for too long. Silva replies him that they will talk about that later. Then Ludger comes and informs Glenn that the appraisal of the materials was done. It was faster than Glenn thought. Ludger tells him that he was surprised to find out that he even have a storage skill now and asks him if he would like to sell it. Glenn flips the pages of lists and tells him that it will be a good idea. Ludger could not believe that he checked all of the contents on a split of second. Glenn replies him that his eyes were pretty convenient in a lot of ways. They were more powerful than any of the appraisal abilities. They really were amazing. Ludger tells him to inform him if anything else comes up. And then Silva takes Glenn to his clan. The clan members asks him if Glenn came as a guest. Silva tells them that he was. He introduces Glenn and tells them that he will join the clan as a trial. Glenn tells Silva that there might be people in the clan who might be not happy for him to join. Silva tells him that there might. Then a young girl comes to Glenn and asks him if he really was going to join their clan. She was looking happy. Then other people also tells him that they all admire him a lot. They asks him if he really rose to a rank all of his own. It was something every adventurer dreamt of. It was the first time someone was looking at Glenn like that. Then Silva tells Glenn that his clan's motto was freedom. They were not forcing anyone to do any quest. Glenn had heard about it even before. It was the same and had not changed a bit. The trial period was 1 month. Silva and Glenn shakes hands and then the trial begins. Just like any other rumor of Glenn, the news of Glenn joining the Silver Knights also spreads like wildfire all across the area. Silva tells him that his rumors interests people. Glenn was concerned if the cat was still around. Silva tells him that she was also the one who has been spreading word of his achievements. Then Silva asks Glenn to show them how fast was he now. A growling sound comes from inside the forest. Glenn gets alert. 2 monster bulls were charging at him, but Glenn sees them and uses magic to stop them. It was not any normal magic. People ask Silva if it was the magic that humans can use. Silva tells them that Glenn was in a whole different league now. He was not the Glenn that he knew. Glenn was always been known as a man who was close to the S rank. They knew for sure that he was a hard worker. Silva was wondering how much did he train to become that strong. No matter what kind of monsters were appearing, he was taking care of them all. After defeating all the monsters, Glenn asks them how was his skills. Silva tells him to not act as if it was normal. The cat girl asks him if he casts strengthening magic on his body. She tells him that even she uses it often as well, but she was impressed by the way he used it so differently. Glenn tells her that his method was a bit different. He tells her that he casts it from the inside of his body unlike others. The cat girl was wondering how to do that. Glenn tells her that it was something impossible to imitate just by watching it. She needed to learn anatomy first. He pats on her head and tells her that she need to study hard for that. He promises her to look into it with her when they gets home. Then the other kids also starts asking for his guidance. Silva tells them all that if anyone has any complaints about Glenn joining the clan, then they can come to him and tell. Everyone replies that they won't, as Glenn was so amazing. It was late. They decides to go home. Glenn tells them to go home while he cleans up the mess there. Thus, Silva nad the others goes back and Glenn stays there. After they were gone, Glenn asks Carlo to come out. Carlo, the cat girl, comes out of the bushes and tells him that his detection abilities has surely improved. As soon as Carlo meets Glenn, she starts attacking him. But Glenn grabs her leg and throws her away. She tells him to be polite with her as she was the older sister. Glenn replies her that it's hard to be polite with someone who has been sniffing around for information on him. Carlo chuckles. She tells Glenn that now she was sure that he really was Glenn, as he was the only person who could argue with her like that. She welcomes him back and gets pissed when there was no response on the side of Glenn. Glenn did not want to give her any support. He asks her if it was a request from the capital that had her following him for the past few days. Carlo tells him that she had to start gathering info from the beginning as he was so much different from before. Glenn tells her that he also made sure that Silva and the others do not notice her. So, he asks her some new info about the capital in return for his favor. Carlo was not ready to tell him, but then Glenn tries to scare her by saying that it would be a bad news if the guards of the Silver Knights knows about how she snuck into their base. Carlo actually gets scared and requests Glenn to not do something like that. Then Carlo tells Glenn that a little while ago he went undercover investigation. It was a request from the biggest big shot of her clients. Glenn asks her if she was talking about Queen Luciana. Carlo tells him that he was right about that. She tells him that she will treat him if he helps her. After Glenn decides to actually help her, Carlo had to give him a treat. She had no idea that he was going to eat so much. Glenn was feeling like his stomach has become bigger in the last year. Then Glenn asks her what did she wanted to talk to him about. Carlo asks him if he changed so much because of his brain healing completely. Glenn was shocked that she knew about that. He tells her that she was right. Then she asks him if his eyes were also renewed or something. Glenn replies her that he has new eyes now. Then Carlo analyzes it and tells him that if what he was saying was true, then whoever healed him has stronger healing abilities than the Saintess. Glenn asks her why was she bringing up the Saintess now. She replies him that a while ago, a woman cast healing magic on him. That person was actually the S-rank adventurer Tia Lealex, and her nickname was Saintess. Glenn conveys his message to Freyna that if he keeps talking like that, then Carlo will get him to talk about the fairy world as well. So, Glenn bluntly tells Carlo that he would like to end the conversation there. Carlo knew that he would say that. She tells him that in exchange she also needs a favor from him. Glenn tells her that he would do it as long as it was something he could do. She asks Glenn to escort the queen. Glenn agrees for it. Carlo takes him to the royal palace through a secret passage. She tells him that a conspicuous place was better if he was hiding something. It was like putting a tree in the forest to hide it. Glenn tells her that he has not much idea about such things. Glenn asks Carlo why does he need to escort the queen when it was actually royal guard job. Carlo tells him that it was not public yet, but the situation of the kingdom was very complicated. She tilts a picture and a secret passageway opens up. It was made by the queen. Glenn asks her why was she telling her something that cannot be made public. She replies that she somehow convinced the queen for it by telling her that Glenn was someone who can definitely help them. Then they enters the queen's room. She was very happy to see Carlo returning so early. The queen asks Glenn his introduction. Glenn tells her about himself, and then Queen Lucian von Julian also introduces herself. Carol was looking all excited around Julian. Julian tells him that Carol was one of her loyal and trustworthy companion. She tells him that she has heard a lot about him from Carol. Julian tells Glenn that she has also heard all the rumors about him, but she only trusts what she hears from Carol. Glenn gives Carol a look when he hears the word trust from the queen. Carlo asks him if he trusts her. She reminds him that they ate together and went on a date as well. Glenn replies that they did that in order to come to the palace to the queen. Julian chuckles to see such funny beef between them both. Carlo tells Glenn that she was hearing her laugh after a very long time. Then the queen comes to the main point. She tells Glenn in brief that her life was in danger. She tells him that the sweets that the king ate were poisoned. She would never poison him, but as she was the closest one, she was being suspected and was put under house arrest. Freyna tells Glenn that she was telling the truth. Glenn asks her how much info had Carol gathered working for her. Carol replies that not much, as the enemy was keeping it well hidden. Then Glenn tells them that he will accompany the queen. Julian asks him if it was because Carol was coming too. Glenn tells her that Carol has nothing to do with it. Then all of a sudden Glenn tells Julian to stand up and move aside. He uses his magic to destroy the closet, and beside it was a guy snicking. Glenn asks Julian if she doubts on someone who might send that guy. The guy tells Glenn that he was not someone suspicious, but Glenn thinks that that was just what a suspicious person would say most probably. Then very seriously Julian tells the guy that he was not permitted to speak. Glenn decides to interrogate him for now. Glenn tells Carol to cover Julian's ears as his method was going to be loud. He then uses a high-voltage electric shock on the guy. Carol asks him if he was still alive. Glenn tells her that he used a magical shock and now he will answer any question he asks him. First Glenn starts with the name. The guy replies that he was Delum Rubesta. Delum Rubesta was the eldest son of the first commander of Order of Chivalry. Carol wonders why was such a guy doing behind the closet. The guy then blabbers a few words like the Queen, Monitor, Royal Assassination, the Nobles. Glenn figures out from this that the former king's aim was to dethrone the Queen. Julian tells Glenn that servants rarely comes to that room. So, if something were to happen to her then it will take a while before someone notice it. Freyna tells Glenn that they should now reveal them about them. Glenn asks her if she was susser about that. Freyna tells Glenn that they should as both of them were keeping a close eyes on Glenn. Thus, Glenn decides to reveal his secret to them. He tells them that he will share them something that he shares with people very close to him and asks them to promise that they will not spill it to someone. Then he tells them the reason why he was away from the capital for the past few years. Carol and Julian could not believe that there was actually something like a fairy realm. Then Freyna also shows up and tells them that she was the chief of the fairies. She tells them that she was contracted by Glenn currently. Julian also introduces herself and Carol as well, although Carol was really shocked to see all this. Then Freyna tells them to not be tensed as they knows that they were Glenn's friends. Glenn tells them that from that point they will also be cooperating with Freyna and the fairies. First they will leave the little fairies he had contracted as a guard. Then Glenn suggests to throw out Delum somewhere and asks Freyna to board up the floor. Freyna takes the responsibility. Carol was still in a daze. Glenn then tells the little fairies to protect the queen properly teleports away. Julian was impressed to see how skillful he was, and now she was more confident that she will be able to prove her innocence. Then Glenn goes to Silva again and tells him everything. He apologizes him for not being able to participate in the clan activities right after joining. Carol tells Silva that Glenn was caught up in a difficult situation of hers. Silva gets pissed and scolds her for acting like innocence while Glenn was the victim there. Then Silva tells them that he will explain it to the clan members so they can focus on their work for now. Then that night, Glenn was asking Carol if she noticed that they were being followed. Carol tells him that she did notice but she did not think that they were bad people and wanted just some info about Glenn. Then she also mentions that she saw one of his former party member, Elaine. Glenn could not notice him coming there. Carol tells him that it was because his atmosphere changed so much now compared to before. That's why he did not notice him. Glenn was not sure what she was trying to say. Freyna also backs Carol by saying that earlier he used to be intimidating but now he has a slightly kinder atmosphere around him. Carol adds that his sharp tongue was something that had not changed but he was easier to get along as compared to before. Glenn finds it best to assume that they were investigating them too. Freyna asks him even if they come near them, what will be the problem? She knew that Glenn does not really want to go back to how things were in the past. They did not know what kind of intentions they had, so they needed to be cautious. Freyna tells him that she has a feeling that they might get involved in some troublesome situation. All that she could do was to pray that the matter gets resolved soon. Then they sneaks into Rubester family's home becoming invisible. Carol sees herself in the mirror and was shocked to see that she had no reflection. They were completely vanished. She was expecting nothing else from the fairy queen herself. Then Glenn sees Dome's house and enters in. They hear someone coming, so they hide safely. It was Dome. They were right behind Dome but he could not know as they were invisible. Then Dome gets a call from inside the home that his breakfast was ready. Then after that Glenn and the others again teleports back to the palace. Glenn was concerned that if what was written in the documents were true then most of the upper echelon would be involved in the incident. Carol was thinking that it would make Julian sad. Next they needed to investigate the Minister of Justice, Duke Vinid's family. Glenn was shocked that they need to even investigate even such a person. Carol tells him that they have been in opposition with the Queen for some times now. This was really depressing for Glenn. Carol was not expecting the enemy to be that big either but she was glad that Glenn was in their side. Glenn tells her that now that he was in the case, he will solve it. Freyna was with them as well. Then they brings the list of nobles that were involved in the royal assassination plot to Julian. Julian asks Glenn if she can really believe that what was written in the paper would be true. Glenn replies that the investigation was done with the help of the fairies for 3 days. So, Julian decides to believe it. Glenn also informs her that none of the royal family members were involved. Julian was really happy to hear that. Glenn tells her that he did some investigation on his own separately and found out that. Juliana thanks him for his kind help. Carol tells him that they were doing good together, so maybe they should permanently become a team. Glenn tells her rudely that if it was not for the queen then he would have never partied with her in the first place. Julian asks Glenn why does he hate Carol so much. Carol tells that she does not understand that either. Glenn gets angry and asks Carol if she really does not remember what she did. He tells her that it was because she was the one who spreaded rumors about him. Carlo quickly babbles that she heard an interesting rumor, so she investigated it and found the truth interesting, so she spreaded it. It was the brothel news that damaged Glenn's reputation the most, and it was spreaded by Carol. Carol tells him that it was not rumor as she knows that it's true. Glenn shouts at her that she should have leave him alone in that case. Then Julian tells them that it will be Carol's fault in that case. Then Glenn tells them to get back to the topic. He asks the queen how would it be if they asks the king to join their side. Julian tells him that it won't be easy as she was forbidden to visit them. She tells him that he can sneak out to meet the king, but it was uncertain that he will trust him. Glenn tells her that they need to catch them all at once or there was a possibility that they might escape. Then Carol tells Glenn that there was only one way to meet the king without relying on the queen. It was Glenn to become an S-rank adventurer.